So thanks everybody for joining us. We'll probably have more people join us as we start. My name is Kalaya Domingo. I work with Communities of Opportunity. I am the lead for our Learning Community Strategy, which supports this amazing speaker series that is designed by Roxay Productions and BDS Planning. We're so grateful to have their support to be able to bring this speaker series to our community. Today's event is Grounded in Abundance. It is the fourth in a 5-part series. Will you go ahead and switch to the next slide? Great. So as we start, I just want to give a few words about Communities of Opportunity and start us with a land acknowledgement. So Communities of Opportunity is a joint initiative with King County and the Seattle Foundation. Our work strives to support community-driven change. We do this through our policy systems change grants that are administered through the Seattle Foundation, as well as our place-based cultural community partnership grants that are supported through our public health departments. Both of those RFPs are available if you're interested in knowing more about our funding. I'll have one of the staff members put a link in to the chat, and you can learn more about the funding that we have open. Our third strategy is around our learning community, and we truly believe that in order to build more equity within King County, it will take all of us working together, really learning from each other, building relationships, and testing new ideas where we can really lean into what it means to create transformation towards the direction of equity and justice. So with that is our topic around abundance today. I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement that is supported through our partners, the Seattle Urban Native nonprofits, and they generously let us use their land acknowledgements when we are hosting our activities. And it just disappeared from my screen, so just a moment while I pull it up. Okay, thank you. So today, many of us, I think, are here in King County, which is where I am right now. So I want to honor that we're on the homelands of the first peoples of this land, the Duwamish, Muckleshoot, Puyallup, Snoqualmie, Stillaguamish, Suquamish, and Tulalip tribes. We raise our hands to honor all the descendants of the Coast Salish people. We thank them for their hospitality as the first peoples of this land and for continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homelands. We honor the immense, immeasurable, and often unrecognized contributions and sacrifices of the Coast Salish and Indigenous people, and we acknowledge the ongoing disparities, racism, and political invisibility experienced by Coast Salish and Indigenous people of this land. When I was thinking about the importance of a land acknowledgement, particularly when thinking about abundance, really thinking about how wealth is created in this country, the land of the Indigenous and Native people, but also the labor that has created wealth in this country. And I want to particularly acknowledge those individuals who were stolen from Africa and forced to work here without payment, and their ancestors who still have not received the reparations, and that wealth is created in the structure and system and has disproportionately impacted both Indigenous and the descendants of Africans who were brought to this country to participate in an unfair and unjust labor structure. So beyond land acknowledgement, I also want to acknowledge the ways that labor has created abundance in this country that has not impacted those, or it's not benefited those who have given the most sacrifice. And really looking forward to hearing from our presenters today the ways that they're rethinking abundance and redistributing the wealth in our communities and the amazing work that they're doing. So I'm going to pass it over to Manny Flores with Roxay Productions, who's going to take us through this journey with our partners and community members to learn more about the ways that they're thinking about abundance.
Yes, well, welcome y'all. Kai I appreciate your words, and especially around the land and recognizing that there's abundance exists in this country and it is not distributed to the people who deserve it. So thank you for that. And you know, to reground everyone in why we're here today, it really is highlighting the fact that abundance is possible, and it's time to shift the narrative away from scarcity. And in order to transform our local economies, we must reflect, analyze, and shift our internal organizational economies. So just again, thank you for joining us today as we learn from our presenters on how to create equitable and sustainable budgets that are rooted in racial equity principles. So if you could go to the next slide. I'm excited because we have some wonderful presenters today. And so I'm going to go ahead and present and kind of introduce them. So I'll start with James. So James Lovell was born and raised in Seattle and now lives in SeaTac with his wife and 3 kids, Theodore, Wilson, and Eleanor. James is white and Ojibwe, an enrolled member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians in Belcourt, North Dakota. James currently serves as the development director for Chief Seattle Club. James is a firm believer in community-centric fundraising principles, including daily work that often includes mistakes around equity, as well as building systems, processes, budgets, and platforms that embed equity in them. So thank you for joining us today, James. Our next presenter is Haregu Kidane. Haregu was born and raised in the Pacific Northwest and obtained her master's in public health from the University of Washington. She has worked with many and for many nonprofit and community-based organizations within the Rainier Valley. Currently, she serves as the Rainier Valley Communities Opportunity Coalition Coordinator, where she manages partnership activities such as planning meetings to discuss strategy and implementation, data collection, evaluation needs, and building organizational capacity. Her background and training in public health as a public health practitioner has prepared her to ensure that community voices are heard and incorporated into decision-making processes. Seeing how the Rainier Valley and Seattle as a whole are in a phase of hyper-development through gentrification and displacement, it's crucial to ensure that vulnerable communities have a cultural or community anchor that roots them in the Rainier Valley. So again, Haregu, thank you for joining us. And our last presenter is David Coven. David hails from the Central District of Seattle, where his passion for access to opportunity was formed. Growing up, he set his sights on breaking the chains of poverty, which led him to study mechanical engineering at the University of Washington. During his undergrad, he worked at the National Science Foundation, Boeing, Tesla, and helped create the Hyperloop for SpaceX's competition. It was through these dream jobs that he realized his calling, helping others pay for college through Scholar Fund, a nonprofit he founded. He believes that access to community, college, and cash are the quickest pathways to breaking down the status quo. David is now expanding the vision of Scholar Fund as they crest more than $283 million in cash assistance managed and $100 million in scholarships managed. Again, thank you for joining us, David, and overall, again, thank you all for the amazing work that you do. I'm excited to hear from y'all. And so I'm going to jump right in and just kind of start with our questions. Feel free to kind of add anything further you would like to, kind of based on what we shared. But our first question is, what is your organization's relationship or journey with today's theme of abundance? And can you share a little bit about that journey? And David, we'll start with you.
Thank you so much. After 2 years, you would think I would know how to unmute my mic quickly. But no, definitely super appreciate it. And I think as we reflect on our journey, our path thus far, our relationship with abundance has kind of been the archetypical like nonprofit race to the bottom, not thinking that there's enough money for the services and work, undervaluing and under delivering on how much things actually cost. And until 2020, we were a team of 2. and with an annual budget of under $70,000. And we thought that's kind of what you had to do as a nonprofit, grind through for a few years until somebody saw the value of your work, and recognizing that the value stems from the people that you're serving. And as we kind of went into pandemic and saw the world shift, be forced to shift their perspective around how we value individuals, organizations, and the services that are delivered, we saw with the stimulus, the ability for institutions to make changes when they want to make changes. And that kind of culminated in the relief fund work that we do now. And so we have exploded from a team of 2 with under a $30,000 budget to now a team of 35, processing several $100 million in programs and payments. And so we have seen kind of the shift in when grantors and when funders and when organizations want to put their momentum and their weight and their money behind something, they do. The barriers are no longer as fixed and as rigid. And so our reflection of abundance has really been in being in that kind of scarcity mindset all the way until the pandemic, when we realized just how valuable the services that we're a part of are, and how malleable funders can be when they want to be. And so we've kind of crested that journey, and super excited to be here to talk about those different elements. But coming from scarcity, living through scarcity, and realizing that the barriers and institutions are much more flexible than we had initially imagined.
Thank you. James, we'll throw it to you.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the introductions, and David for sharing your piece too on that first question. Chief Seattle Club, we've been around since 1970, and that's not the beginning of homelessness, sadly, for Native folks. The kind of modern iteration of it came about in the 50s and 60s when a lot of Native folks were forced off their reservations into urban areas with the hope of assimilation. And that essentially we do what happened with my family is my mom married a white guy, and now my blood quantum is lower and my kid's blood quantum is lower, and it keeps descending until the government gets rid of that Indian problem. And that's kind of where some of this begins, is that this idea of abundance is that's a problem. Like being Native is a problem that we need to get rid of as a country. And that is baked into the very core of all US funding, all US programming. So, in the many first early decades of Chief Seattle Club, a lot of the relationship with abundance was really having a place where Natives felt like they could come and be Native, right? Where that wasn't the thing that was being removed from them. It's like you bring the abundance. Sadly, it's an abundance of shared experiences through some trauma, but it's also a lot of shared experiences through cultural practices and folks from all over the country in this one urban core. And what that leads to, though, is you do a lot. And you say we're doing more than other folks are doing for our people in this area, than mainstream folks are doing, and you let that grow, right? Abundance is like a seed it's a seed, and it grows, and it keeps you keep tending to it. And so it went from some drop-in services to a standard day center. Folks can come in and get off the streets, and then it's like, well, what are we doing at night? We're losing folks at night. They're going off, and maybe they'll come back the next day. So how do we house people? How do we keep people with us so that they're making progress? How do we really take care of this? And that's led to us opening our first housing in January, which has 80 units. And I'll refer to that several times today, because I think that's kind of, it's a good visual for what I think of with abundance in our community. So the journey really has gone from, a few good-natured, well-intentioned non-Native folks doing some good work to help Native people into a Native organization that is close to $140 million in housing assets and has more than 200 units that are open or will be open, doing more. We are doing more than almost any other organization to take care of this thing that everyone points to on the street. And we're actually just doing the thing. So that's where I'll leave that part.
Thanks, James. Haregu, do you want to go ahead and share your answer?
For sure. So hello, thank you so much, Manny, for the wonderful introduction. My name is Kidane, as many will know. And the organizations that I work with are primarily community-based organizations. So they range from having potentially one full-time staff member, or maybe not one full-time staff member, maybe a volunteer, to having a full-time staff. So that has always been a little bit difficult to navigate in terms of like, how do we share resources when there's already that inequity in the room in terms of some organizations are more established than others. And so our relationship with Abundance really took place when our COO work came together, and a lot of our projects were overlapping in terms of our organizations having capital campaigns, fundraising, having similar programming, and also having cross programming as well. And so as time went on and we're trying to figure out how do we equitably distribute funds, we kept coming upon more of a scarcity mindset. And I mean, obviously, this happens at many tables, but we identified it as a problem because we really wanted to build a partnership that was based on strong coalitions. And so it's one of those things of we really learn through experience, learn through conflict, learn through building relationships, that it's really important that that we go towards more of thinking and having an abundance mindset. And so for us, we'll get into this some future questions, but looking into our equity framework, talking a little bit more about how can we engage more public and private stakeholders, and how can we tell our story better to be able to bring in more resources versus just thinking about the same couple of resources. So expanding our network, thinking more domestic versus just local resources, as well as international. Really, we can take this as far as we want to. And so that is really the switch from that scarcity mindset to the abundance, really trying to move forward with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, that was a perfect segue into our next question, actually, and we'll start with you again. Where does scarcity mindset come from, and how does it continue to prevail in our world when we understand and know there is actually so much wealth in the world? And so, if you want to share your insights on that.
For sure, I definitely think there are still a lot of issues with access to capital, whether that's in the form of or just funding. Whether we look at banks or other private institutions, a lot of times folks of color as well as white folks may have encountered issues if they don't have a certain background or don't meet a certain set of criteria. And so I think that it's always difficult to manage institutional fairness or talk about public funding, because you kind of have to meet a certain set of criteria that is not necessarily always discussed. So kind of like I said, one of the organizations I work with is not a formal entity. So they always come up with issues in terms of, oh, we want to work with a 501c3 and things like that. Something else I also think is it's something that's discussed, but maybe not highlighted. The use of, or the fact that a lot of these opportunities are in English, and even if you primarily speak English and have a command on the language, it's still really difficult to navigate portals and navigate relationships, because there's a certain, you're not in the room, you're not invited to the table. So where I do see that changing, but there's still that institutionalized language that's there that, like I said, may be difficult. As well as kind of the inability for folks who may be given funding, and like I said, this is changing, but fund preventative work or to fund work that is really more, the funding prevention, I think, is always very difficult. And that's my last point there. Thank you.
Yeah, and just a little bit about that is where you kind of saying like this idea of how do we support the work before the problems occur versus like this reactionary work of you need to prove a problem exists for us to kind of address it. I think it's super important. Yeah. David, do you want to go ahead and answer this question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's not a ton that I can add. I think that was beautifully said. The one piece of context that I see often is in nonprofits and in public work especially, there's this race to the bottom. That good work is one that overhead for some reason is separated from programmatic work, as if the staff that are doing the things to actually make the mission be accomplished don't exist or aren't people or shouldn't be paid to like make the process happen. That without those individual staffs, that somehow magically solutions still get solved for really some of the most important and like critical difficulties, circumstances, and problems that folks are going through. And so when I think about like the prevalent nature of scarcity, literally everything that I've ever been taught about nonprofits from like traditional sources reinforces this mindset of scarcity. You don't want your admin to look more than 3%. You want to make sure that this dollar is accounted for in ways that are never asked on the other side or in any other industry or institution. And then when we look at it, it's always this comparative. You may not want to collaborate with this organization because what if their admin is slightly lower and you look less favorable? Everything becomes these series of competitions that look at how do we show and prove that the work is valuable for the money that's being spent, and judged on a curve where the cost to provide housing is way different than the cost to provide digital resources. And so there's so many pillars of inequity that intersect here. And I think also that was highlighted and mentioned as we look at folks of color in particular, a lot of us come from low-income backgrounds. And so we come from situations and circumstances in which abundance in terms of capital does not exist. And then we're put into places where we want to do good work without access to networks and resources that are capital abundant, and then just expected to make magic out of nothing. And so I don't think that there has been a shifting tide from like funding institutions to really reflect on the way in which they prioritize funding, the way in which they break apart this minimization of work, or this race to the bottom where everyone has to be the lowest spender to prove that they're doing quality work. And I feel like every time I step into a traditional nonprofit or public space, that is not just the expectation, but moving counter to that seems to break like the core conception of what nonprofit or public work is. And so I think having spaces like this, where we very explicitly and blatantly reject the norm and reject the fundamental principle of underpaying and overworking folks is like one of the first critical steps in hopefully shifting the tide. But I think every system of inequity reinforces that folks should be paid less and expected to do more simply because we care about the work and we care about the people associated with the work. Yeah.
Thanks, David. That was amazing. And thinking through what you and Haregu shared, I do want to come back and follow up. Y'all shared some instances around almost like navigating the system and what it means to get through that. I'm going to jump to James, but I do want to come back to you on and just kind of give you all some space. And James, feel free to add this in your answer around like, what did you do to navigate that? How are you actively, dismantling systems that are only in English and things like that? So I'll give you some time to think through that as we give James some time to answer.
Yeah, well, I'll try not to think as I answer because I don't think that goes well for most people. So I think my answer will be shorter than Haregu's and David's because they've given like key technical points and like inspiring points. I will say that as I was reviewing this question and thinking about it, I went kind of like what I think the biggest source, right? Scarcity mindset, I think, comes first and foremost from racism and misogyny and patriarchy and anti-LGBTQ power hoarding bullshit from straight white men. And I just want to put that out there as my big points on that. As far as like things we've done, I have some notes I was thinking about where and when to share, but one of the biggest ways to challenge scarcity mindset, I think, is it's like using the tool of the oppressor is to say no to people. And I don't want to attack funders because I think we actually have pretty good funders in our region compared to we see people funding heinous stuff out there. And our local funders really tend not to do that. We've got some great folks, but when funders come to you with funding that's not enough, it is like it's another form of patriarchy where they're telling you this is how much it takes to do the thing. And we need to be able to say, like David, I got chills when you said hundreds of millions of dollars. I was like, oh man, that just gave me this excitement. And when I talk about our property, it's 140 million plus in assets on, it's like, I still get a little bit chilled around it because that is not scarcity thinking that creates that kind of language. And so I think a lot of it is when folks come to you, with a tool to oppress you into scarcity by saying this is how much it is and this is what you can do. This is how much your admin can be. This is what counts as admin. This is what counts as program. You have to have at least X amount in evaluation and this, and this. I think it's really powerful when you say, no, thanks, but no thanks. I have gotten more yeses when I've said no than when I've said yes. So when a funder comes to you, it's like, did you get that funding? It's like, yes. How did you get it? I said no. I said, we don't want it because you're telling me to perpetuate scarcity. And we're not going to do that. And I have some other, like, one of the things, for the funders who are being not so good, it's just like that. I'm not going to let you do that. For the funders who I know have it in them, I think of that James Baldwin quote of, if I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see. And a lot of these funders just don't know that their application is creating more scarcity and is creating power imbalances and perpetuating really, really horrible stuff. So if I really think these are good funders, I need to go to them and tell them no, because you're not seeing that this is a bad thing. And if it's a funder that I'm not as excited about, well, I just go and I sleep really well that night because at least I spoke my piece to power while I could.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And again, I would want to give space to any of you who wanted to continue to share about how you've navigated that space. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one way a lot of the organizations that I've worked with have addressed this too is making sure that we have a diverse staff and that the staff represent the groups, or not represent necessarily, but can either have multiple language skills or that we have translations available and things like that. But yeah, to just address your question, but we haven't really thought too much about that. But those are just some things that we're doing to be proactive.
Yeah, the thing that I really like about James' answer about no is on both sides. And so oftentimes when you say yes, the things you do not want to be a part of, it ends up way worse than if you had said no in the first place. And one of the things that we do in every single interaction is we interrogate the oppositional no. And so we do a lot of contracts with government, with programs that are funding undocumented folks, low-income folks, cash assistance, tax-free payments. And so we run up to every legal complication under the sun in terms of like how to pay people, how to track and manage and show accountability and all those different things. And so when we hear no from like funders or from organizations or government, we're like, why? Like, let's really break. You're not just gonna tell me no, you're gonna justify. And I want to see the statute, I want to see the law, I want to see what implementation we're upholding. Because if we're holding best practices, then obviously they're not best practices because they're not serving the folks that we're talking about. If we're upholding, and we often get 80% of the time is, well, that's how we used to do it. And I'm like, well, that's not how you're going to do it if you're looking to align with the solution that we're talking about. And so we went, I think the biggest case is like the payments that we work on for undocumented folks and like the payments that we do to take advantage of tax-free implications and public benefit. And that when we first got into the space, no one that we knew of or that we could find were doing cash payments. We're doing direct payments to individuals. Everyone was like, nope, you can't do this. There's all these compliance pieces. And we were like, well, why not? Like, let's actually get down into it. And so we read the IRS declaration around disaster relief payments. We were getting like 300 pages of like IRS documents. And we were like, well, this says you can do it. And so it's not a you can't do it, it's that you don't want to. And let's be explicit and let's be clear. So when we go to the next founder, we go to the next conversation, we're going to say they just didn't want to do it. They talk about the alignment. We show up in spaces aligned, but we don't actually commit to that alignment. And I think that was one of the pivotal pieces where it first started at the Attorney General's office or the governor's office. And we were like, well, if they can't tell us no for these particular reasons and stand behind it, then they make the rules. And so that has kind of trickled down into our interrogation of no. And if there's a law, if there's a legal element, cool, awesome, we'll navigate to the next piece. But oftentimes we find folks are accustomed to that safety net of doing what's already been done. And so challenging that at every step of the way is necessary and paramount. But for orgs that are watching this, it is also exhausting It is also something that most organizations don't have the support to do. And so I think there's this double-edged blade where you're constantly trying to validate and verify that what you're doing is of value, while also trying to justify the importance of shifting from what's always been done. And so it is a hard task, but you should always ask why the no is there, and if that has room to change.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. Anyone else feel like they want to add anything before we move on? And I do think we touched a lot of these things, but I really wanted to see, from y'all's perspective, what else are y'all doing in your organization that is different from traditional nonprofits? So how do we name those things for folks who are here today? And almost to your point, David, like what was easy and what is hard? What is difficult? What continues to be a barrier? So it doesn't feel like, go do this. And all your answers will be solved, but what actually are things that people could look forward to that may be easier, and what things will be the journey?
Yeah, I think from our organization, I don't come from traditional nonprofits. So I studied mechanical and aerospace engineering, and I created a nonprofit because I didn't see a solution that was existing for folks that centered community. And so every time we look at something, I recognize that the folks that I get to work with are some of the brightest, most brilliant people, and they can work anywhere. And so every process and system is built around what makes folks comfortable staying, what makes folks comfortable growing, and how do you build around folks' ability to solve their own problems. And so we look at every single thing from compensation. We were looking at comparative reports, and we're like, well, it doesn't make sense to pay people $18 an hour for work that I'm barely qualified to do. Like, this is intense work that people have spent their entire lives doing. And so we reevaluate, how do you pay people? The different ways you can pay people to make sure that you're taking care of circumstance and citizenship and all those other elements. We looked at every single rule that was like the typical large nonprofit and evaluated, does this help us? Does this help us grow faster? Does it stand up as like bureaucratic, like this is what everyone does? Or does it actually allow us to move faster, to serve more people as empathetically and human-centered as possible? And so from the way, like, you see it all the time. Like, I think one of the most interesting cases that trickles up to every decision is when we have folks ask a request for the tools they need for their home office. We see initial perception is always, I'm going to get the cheapest chair, the cheapest desk, the cheapest mouse. And we started to like evaluate, like, does that trickle down to the way in which we make decisions? We're going to do exactly what the like lowest approach is, because that's the easiest to get passed through. And so trying to have a process that allows people to say yes more often than they say no, trying to have consistent evaluation for how is this serving all the folks that are around us, and then trying to make sure that that reflects in all the conversations we have with funders and with people we're in contact with. And so the easy pieces are the ones that are internal. The ones that get difficult are the ones that truly obstruct like programmatic operations. And that's where we go and find legal and financial counsel that are super helpful in saying, hey, like, what can we do that is not conventional? Not what does everyone else do? What is actually allowable to make sure that this velocity can happen and that we can serve and support people? Those are the hardest conversations, because so often folks are just enshrined in what has always been done. But those are often the most rewarding because they lift up barriers that have been there simply because they were put there by someone else long ago.
Thanks, David. Haregu, I was just going to come to you, so perfect.
Thank you. Yeah, so the organizations that I work with, actually, we created an equity framework. And what this is really, so let me backtrack a little bit. So all of the organizations that I work with have received COO funding. And when they received COO funding, it was put upon us to figure out how we're going to split up our funds. And so the first year, actually, partners came together and had 2 meetings that spanned about 9 hours. And it was really difficult to kind of talk about how do we split up funding, and scarcity mindset definitely was very much in the room. So for the next couple of years, this was multi-year funding, we talked about how do we want to move. And so we worked with a consultant to create an equity framework. We created a reference sheet that uses language that is similar with definitions so that we know what different descriptions of power, different descriptions of privileged identities, pressed identities, in between, things that people don't necessarily talk about when we're talking about funding. This was followed by a proposal. And so that proposal has questions about your organization's capacity, program questions in terms of, or project questions, I should say, in terms of what are you looking to apply for? And lastly, funding or other funding sources that your organization may have. So this is really to get a holistic picture of your organization to see, what resources do you have? And after that, partners will fill out that proposal, we'll come together, each organization will score the other organization's proposals. And after that scoring process, it'll all be tallied up and we'll have a meeting then. So that way folks can come really prepared into the room to talk about how should you split out funding versus thinking about their own organization, thinking about their needs, just being very centered around themselves. I should also say that we are a part of a partnership, so we have those existing relationships that we want to really keep intact. And so this has really been helpful for us not to get into that scarcity mindset trap. What's been really easy is that now that we have this template, now that we have this process, and we went through it twice in 2 years now, I think we've got the process and how to kind of have these conversations. What's been difficult is when an organization, let's say, continuously scores really low, but is still trying to to better their organization, to get more resources, to do all of those things. How do we continuously support those organizations if it's not through financial means or through that grant source? So kind of what we came up with, and this is the part that's been difficult in terms of, can we support an organization that scored lower on the proposal? Can we provide them capacity support in terms of if they have events and having other organizations step in to support those events, to volunteer? If, let's say, an organization has, one of the organizations I work with has a fundraising staff member, full-time staff member. And so lending that person to the organization that scored the lowest, potentially apply for a grant to get some more funds. Constantly looking for innovative ways to make up for a lack of funds has just been, it's definitely been a journey, but it's been something that we've definitely explored and really have really kind of finessed. So it's been a great process.
Yeah, and I wanted to highlight it and really acknowledge, the piece of kind of sharing and reading other people's proposals. Also gives that perspective of right, I'm not just on one side, but what does it look like to read it from the other side? As we shift and want to shift the narratives and the navigational kind of ways of being, there is some sort of, I need to understand how they exist now, right? I need to understand how people will read my application now, even as we work to dismantle or transform things. So it was really nice to hear that piece.
And then Manny, if you wouldn't mind, I think someone in the chat asked for if I could send out the framework. Unfortunately, I can't, but I can screen share for a second. That's okay.
I would, Alyssa, is that a possibility? We got some support on this.
I think so. Can you do it right now or
no?
Okay.
No, it's a post-disabled participant screen
okay.
sharing.
How about now?
Yes, perfect. So this is, let me go to the reference sheet here. So this is the keywords that I was talking about in terms of, just kind of having a definition where we can all look back at and kind of just share language, right? So some examples down here of power. And we will be sharing this with folks largely. It's just we haven't gotten to that stage quite yet. We're still fine-tuning this process. And then let me just briefly share, this is the proposal sheet where I was talking about the capacity questions, as well as project questions, and then down below are the funding questions. This here is just basically where you score each of the organizations. So we did it by activity, but you can do it by organization or however. So as you see some of the questions here, and then this looking forward section is really more, there's a laundry list of questions that are a little bit more detailed, and we found over time that it may be difficult to get exact answers, but we thought it was important to place a specific emphasis on time. So, you have here COVID-19 implications and things that are happening right now. So, and then some more money questions, and that's basically the funding questions once again. So thank you. Just wanted to share that really quick, and thank you for, I think it was Jody, for asking for that. And like I said, I'll definitely make sure that we get that out, hopefully by the end of the year, maybe sometime in early 2023.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing that. I think that is what today is about, right? What is not just in theory, but what are people doing and how are you doing these things? So thank you for taking that time. James, you haven't had a chance to speak in a while, so I wanted to give that space for you.
Yeah, I was thinking of something we're doing differently than traditional nonprofits, and it's much less abstract than some of the other things I've talked about. It's a very concrete example, I think, which is that we've thought about what happens when you are trying to stay within budget, and you know that not all staff are going to get the full 3% pay raise. Some folks' performance are going to get them a 1.2% or a 3% or a 4.5% for higher performers or something like that. We looked at who that benefits. That benefits supervisors who haven't done their chores, who haven't done their work of supervising and training and coaching people. It benefits higher paid staff. So we've taken this idea of merit raises, and we've crumpled the paper up and thrown it in the trash. Then we burned the trash can. Then we spread the ashes and said, we're done with that. We're making accountability go up. Everyone in the organization gets a 5% raise at their 1 year or whatever it is. If you get to a 1 year as a supervisor and you're saying, well, gee, this person hasn't been performing that well, I'm going to give them 3%. That's you as a supervisor who has failed to coach someone, failed to support someone to grow and to perform well. And now you're going to start messing with their pay. And this is not the way we do things. Is you don't make people fear the scarcity of money in their home, right? If it's taking you a year to give someone feedback on their performance, that's on you as a supervisor. You are the one who has to manage this and budget that your staff are getting that. You need to budget your time instead of messing with people's pay. So that's just a specific example we have where, and that goes all the way up from my position all the way up to the or from my position to all of my staff, the executive director, any of our frontline staff. That happens. That does mean hopefully that we'll get in a place where folks are having conversations earlier, and maybe there's performance stuff that comes up. We just launched this within the last 6 months. We've been building it and launching it and making sure folks understand it. But that's one way, and that ties in a lot with budget, because first off, it makes your budgets much more predictable because you know exactly, like, it's a better thing to do. You know exactly it's going to be 5%, right? So it's just a stronger tool rather than finding out later that, some staff were punished for being advocates for themselves. Some staff are rewarded for being advocates for themselves and getting different amounts of money. So I hope that's I don't have I really like seeing your spreadsheet, Haregu. We don't have like a good write-up on that yet. So this is a reminder I need to do that, to just say this is where accountability really should be, not on low paid staff getting hurt because their supervisors haven't been coaching them, their director hasn't been managing them and coaching them well. It should be on move all the way up through folks.
I like this idea of documentation too, because it is it's accountability tool, right? It is a resource. It is giving every single person in that organization the chance to say, well, this is what you committed to. Where is the follow through? Where is the the actual impact? So I appreciate that, the idea of even highlighting documentation. But it actually brings us to our next question. We maybe come back to another one, but I wanted to jump to, can you all walk us through a budget that is transformed by aligning with abundance and what that could look like? Where that funding comes from, and I know some of you've touched here and there, and how is it sustained? I think that is the biggest piece of the work is with, we've all experienced in the last 2 years so many shifts and so many things that have impacted and continue to impact our organizations. So sustainability is a big thing that I also wanted to kind of give space for you to talk through. James, take it away.
Yeah. So I was thinking about the way that we went about building this building that we have. These 80 units are kind of landmark building down in Pioneer Square. And for those of you who are in housing or have ever been a part of trying to finance a building, basically you look at how many units there are and how much it costs per unit, and there's some kind of industry norms around that. And then anything you want to do that you add onto it just makes your cost per unit go up. And so a lot of people are like, here's that cost per unit, stay under that and your project will qualify for this kind of financing, this kind of tax credit, this kind of grant and all that. And when you try to do that, you may build a building that fits the norm, but you're not building a building that helps people the way it should. And I'll share a quick story. When I was a kid in elementary school, my mom would come pick us up from school, right? And she's this incredible, beautiful brown woman. And she comes in and picks up her little light-skinned, redheaded kid. I used to have hair, believe it or not. Her little light-skinned, redheaded kid. And people would ask her, is that your kid? Are you supposed to be picking them up? Are you their babysitter? And that's just like, when you think about that, right? So she'd come home and she's got these big old shoulders and she'd be all tense and ready to just take someone out. She'd get to her van, they wouldn't go down. She'd get out, we'd get home, they wouldn't go down. Like when she closed her door, her shoulders would start to go down a little bit. She could start to breathe again. She could start to be this beautiful, incredible brown woman again. And I think about our members on the streets. If we build a rectangle, a building that looks like every other building, it doesn't mean much to them. They're gonna walk by it and it's not gonna change the way they're feeling. It's not gonna change the way they're interacting with people on the street. So we said, we're gonna go bigger. Take your cost per unit. That's a great thing to have. But what we really want to have is when people see this building, it looks like home. And that's what the word for this building all means. It means home in Lashutsi. They don't have to wait till they close their door in their unit for their shoulders to drop, because then they're not talking to their colleagues or their other residents, their neighbors and folks. They're not engaging in the community. So we raised more money. We said it takes Coast Salish brickwork on the outside. It takes a welcome figure on the corner. It takes a 40-foot tall matriarch on the side of the building, because when people are anywhere, when they're coming up from the light rail and they see that, their shoulders are going to go down a little bit because they're home. It's downhill from here, folks. We can do this. You can get to a place that's safe with other Native people. You're not going to be left out. No one's going to ask, are you supposed to be here? We are supposed to be here. It is a hard thing for a Native woman to be asked, are you supposed to be here? We are supposed to be here. So that's a little bit of a story piece around it, but that it does come down to being, you still have to make decisions. You have to make hard decisions. Okay, this many community spaces, amenity spaces, this much art, but we push the envelope on that. The cost per units in this building is ridiculous. No one would have funded us unless we knew it was absolutely essential to people succeeding and surviving in this building, that they be okay to be Native and that they're supposed to be here.
Thank you so much, James. Appreciate you sharing your experiences. Haregu, do you want to kind of share your answers to this question?
Sure. I think I hit on it a little bit in my previous answer, so I don't want to, I'll just briefly go over that. But generally, like I was saying, folks get less funding or score lower on their proposals, and we find other ways to supplement that lack of funding. So in terms of capacity support, like I was saying, fundraising support, I think I can get a little bit more into fundraising actually. Something that we've really worked on as a coalition or as a partnership is really to make sure that we're fundraising all together. And so this year we've taken steps to create a case statement and to really show what our story is, who we are, and what we want to do in the future, as well as drafting an LOI, a letter of intent, and having a potential grant list, so that this fall we can go into really thinking about if we are primarily, right now, we're primarily working off of one grant. And so diversifying our grant, diversifying the grants that we're applying to, and diversifying our partnership in terms of partnering with one or two organizations to apply for funding to keep those relationships going, but not necessarily having to work all together all the time. So that's something that we've really kind of clung to. Just how can we fundraise and get more funding, and continue to partner and show people, to tell people who we are, as well as show people what we want to do.
Thank you. David.
The only thing I think just giving examples that additionally complement both of these, and in particular, abundance budgets. What they allow us to do is invest in people who are doing the work, and what that results in is higher quality experiences for the community members that we're serving. And like the examples that I think of is in this space in particular, where we're doing cash assistance, when we're doing direct payments or subsidies, what we're recognizing is people are accustomed to having horrible experiences. And like, this is the norm. When you're waiting for government benefits, or you're waiting for any sort of thing that benefits you, you are expected to endure circumstances that never happen if you're on the other side. So when you owe an institution money, when you have to pay at the store, they're expecting instant reconciliation. They're expecting all these levels of support and reciprocity that does not exist on the other end. And so when we started to get larger budgets and budgets that were actually reflective of like, how do we make a more quality experience, we saw other programs when we were trying to figure out how do you actually build a payment delivery mechanism, advertise, get a direct deposit within 3 to 4 weeks. We saw that we were able to bring that down to 2 to 5 days. We saw that checks by default were like a 5-week thing for individuals if you're thinking about the entire state. And we were able to get that down to 5 days, down to next day delivery, depending on the circumstance. And so what it allowed us to do is figure out, at the end of the day, the only thing that we care about is making sure that the recipients and that the folks who are applying have the best possible experience because they're coming to us in their times of greatest need. Right? All of our programs are focused on low-income folks who need direct access to paying for things like healthcare, bills, groceries, everything like that. And so what we found is that the way in which we are being paid directly inhibits or breaks down the barrier or gate for individuals who are on the other side. And so when we're able to pay for faster tools or better availability, or just pay for more customer support folks so that we can answer people on the phone, we can send them text messages. It's not funny, but it's super interesting that every time we're in a conversation with a different tool, trying to figure out if they can do the same element or if we can step back, all of their stuff is, we only send messages in English, we only send them between 8 a.m. and noon, we only send this type of thing, you can only have this one type, but they're still charging 17%. Like, they're still making all of this money. And so none of our programs so far have eclipsed 10%, which is still in that scarcity mindset element. Most of our programs have been between 2 to 6.5%. And with that, because a bunch of us were engineers, we were able to figure out, okay, abundance isn't just meaning that we get paid better and that we also have better standard of living. It means that directly contributes and impacts the quality of experience for the folks on the other side. And so I think bigger budgets and then recognizing that all of this value, all of this labor has cost. And so that does not mean better experience for individual applicants and community members, means horrible experience for the folks who are running the organization. And so trying to balance both of those, I think, is what you get. It's the only place, like if you work anywhere else in like capitalism or for profit, you're not expected to be doing good work, but you can be compensated well. And so it implies that doing good work should compensate you poorly in this weird twist of fate that should not exist anywhere else. And so I think when you have budgets that are reflective of human value and human capacity, all parties benefit. The funder gets better results because that's what they care about and impacting community. But ultimately, the folks who are doing the work are supported. You reduce burnout, and community members have better access to the support and resources that they've been asking for decades. None of this is new, right? We've known what these problems are for decades, far before I was born. And so I think as we align, we're seeing shifts and change and outcomes that are reflective of people are less burned out, hopefully, when we do this with abundance. People have better access to the tools they need, and community members can better access spaces that have higher quality to start with.
Thank you. Thank you. Again, y'all just sharing gems. And so I appreciate each and every one of you. And as we talk through the journey and what y'all have experienced, and I think there's one part of navigating and spaces where, like you say, where you give the no, right, the traditional space of navigating, but I also wanted to ask, have you or are you planning on having conversations with funders about these shifts, and what have they been, if you've had those, and what have you noticed needs to exist for funders to be more receptive of the way that you all shared that has an impact in community, yeah, what things need to be highlighted for funders so they're able to receive these things. I just give some space for folks to process, and if you have an answer, feel free to unmute and answer.
You
We
got it,
muted at
David.
the exact same time.
You got it.
I can do a few quick things. I think especially because we have probably been in the nonprofit space and in the grant space the least amount of time. And so things that I've seen that I really want to emphasize is funders need to hold funders accountable. And so like, awesome, cool, like we can say these different things, but oftentimes nonprofits are still beholden to like budgets and end of deadlines. And what I don't want to see, and which I do see, is funders are treating us different than they're treating other organizations I know applying to the same funds. And part of that is relationships, and part of that is our ability to have experience with a particular funder. And so keeping each other accountable. And so as you shift relationships with your individual providers, like recognizing the space of the power dynamic you hold as a funder, and the obligation is not just to the organization we have here, but it's to recognizing that we have to go to dozens of funders to get one project fulfilled. And so like the ability to move that needle is exponentially helped when funders are talking to other funders about how they're shifting their expectations, how they're shifting their communication, the things that they're willing to fund, and the ways in which they know they can be flexible, but just haven't because they've never been asked to by entities with parallel power dynamics. And so I think that's the biggest thing. Like we've seen funders shift to our conversation as we've gotten bigger, which I think is also problematic. And that how do you scale if you only get the support and introduction to the resources when you're already large enough to have like full staff dedicated to doing this. And so taking more chances, taking more bets, and recognizing that outcomes are so much more than just numbers on a spreadsheet. Like every time you influence someone's salary, every time you influence like the quality of life, that is an outcome that should be recognized. But I think the biggest thing that I have to add is having funders keep funders accountable.
Thank you. James, I know you also muted, so you got some ideas.
Yeah, not a ton. I mean, obviously, I think a lot of it is covered by David already. Like, for us, a lot of it is trust. Do you have trust in the funder? Do they trust you? But I think remembering that it goes both ways, right? That just because a funder comes to you and is saying they want to hear from you, really try to parse out if they actually want to hear from you, or if they're required just by their program director to come and listen to you. Because a lot of times I'll share stuff with someone, and by the time it makes it back, they say, well, thank you so much for your feedback. We heard you all. And then you see the results of their data, and it's like, were you even in that session? That's nothing that anyone said. I'm sure of this. I know who else was interviewed by you. I know all your grantees. So I have an advantage, David, that I've been in the nonprofit sector long enough to have known several of the other grantees on these, where we just come together and said, that's not what we said. I was asked, like, did you see that list they came out with? What is that? So one of the things I've learned is that Seattle is a small town with long memories. A former boss of mine used to say that, and we really are. And so when you start talking about like local funders and stuff, I think it's almost like two different conversations. But I think one of the areas where and yes, like get other funders to talk to other funders, like that is their job. One of the pieces that we've tried to emphasize is we are going to like what accountability means. So when we are building a budget, when a funder says that doesn't, how do you know that works? We don't know if that works, or I can see that it's not working for you. We don't build our budgets just based on what is working. We look at what's not working well, and we try to invest more in it to make it work well, because we know, and unless it's something that we know just isn't the right solution. But this came from an experience I had in the youth development world, where there was this assessment, and folks were saying, well, anyone who scores high on the assessment gets extra money, right? They get a little bit of a good job incentive pay. And one of the researchers said, that is the opposite. You should be giving more money to the programs that score poorly, because these are the programs that the system is failing and that the structures are not there for. So you should be investing more in low performing programs. That's exactly the way I feel like these conversations need to go with funders when they're saying, well, it looks like you haven't been doing as well. It's like, you need to absolutely fund us where we're not doing well, because I guarantee you it's not our lack of belief in knowing that we belong here and that we can do this thing and we can be housers while we're doing street outreach, while we're doing DVSA work. It's that we can't do it all at once when you're only giving us a $25,000 grant with, 20,000 of which is spoken up through the requirements you have to work with volunteers or something. There's like, let's be real about this, is that you want us to do the things that aren't being done, fund those things. And then the caveat is, don't let anyone unfund you to do the other things, because then they're just creating a new area that's underfunded. So say, listen, yeah, you did. You funded this other stuff and it's going well, and you're not going to fund this other stuff that's not going well. Well, great news. You get to fund us twice. You get to keep your funding for the stuff that's going well and fund it, and be ready to say no. Because just for me, that's what's been successful in this role, is when they say no, we can only stay with the one. And it's like, if you're only staying with the one, you don't get to talk about this other one, because you're not showing me that you're accountable to it. You're just poking holes at me and not showing up to support where the gaps are. And if you're even open to funding the gap area, I'm not going to let you back off the things that are working. So that's and I'm probably all sounds a little good from here, where I'm like pontificating about these. There's obviously lots of negotiations, and with trusted funders, it's never quite as easy. It's just like, no, we're done. They'll come back and say, okay, let's work through this. And you're like, well, they've earned the trust and they've earned my time to work through this, because they've given the general operating, they've given the multi-year, they've given the conversation. But there's a lot of it where it is like, I'm sorry, you don't get to tell me what accountability looks like. Accountability looks like doing the things for my community that no one else is doing, and you're going to support that, or you're not going to get to be a part of the big win. When we have a belief that Indians started this stuff here, and we're going to be the last ones here to finish it. And if you want us to do that, then you don't get to just say, oh, that sounds good, and let's put that on a piece of wood and plaque on outside of a building. You've got to invest in us to do this work.
Not the name on the side of a building.
Just really quickly, I wanted to add in just a little bit more here, because I think that both of you hit a lot of points, but I wanted to say that being in this unique partnership structure where I work with 4 organizations who are also coalitions, this aspect of having strong relationships has really kind of permeated to like a bunch of different things that partners are doing. So in this aspect of when speaking with funders, I've realized that over the years, partners have definitely gotten more comfortable about speaking more candidly together about interactions they've had with funders and experiences that they've had, as well as coalescing around, we see that this RFP is out, or, we see this issue and we want to solve it, put our heads together and kind of have a strategy. So we have a lot of folks who have different skill sets, from legal expertise, coalition building, to community organizing, and policy analysis as well, and kind of bringing those people into one room to kind of talk about across organization, as well as how do we address some issues from like a stance of as a partnership versus coming at it individually. And so that has also been very successful, but it's definitely taken some time to get there, because like I said, you have to have really strong relationships to be able to kind of share those experiences that you've had individually or organizationally.
Yeah, I love that, the community-centric approach. I think as y'all were talking, the other things that I was thinking through is like, how do we tell funders stop funding their friends? Like, it's about this like who game, and move away from that. And I think the other thing I think through is like, what does it look like to fund things when they're not trendy? Right? Like, how do we actually commit to community when it's not like, as things occurred in the last 2 years, and folks shifted to like, all of a sudden wanting to support, communities of color, Black and Indigenous communities, because it became more trendy now. How can we keep people accountable to doing this when it's no longer trendy, when it's no longer, something that gives them credit or credibility? Appreciate the money, and how, I guess the sustainable question. That's not necessarily a question to you all. I mean, if you all want to answer, you're more than welcome. But it's just like, I think those things need to be said no. Yeah. Well, moving on to our next, last question for y'all.
Manny, there's 2 questions in the Q&A. Are we saving those for the end?
Yeah, we got some space after this last question for these, unless anyone is feeling really, really inspired to answer those questions now. We have some space at the end to answer these questions. So for anyone else, as we're kind of answering this last question and other questions are popping up for you, please throw them in the Q&A section, and we'll have space at the end for those. So go ahead and add those in there. But our last question is, what are 3 concrete things that organizations can do to start shifting into a culture of abundance? And so I know you've kind of named a lot of these things, but if you had to pick 3 top things that you recommend someone to walk away and start doing today, what would those be? And do you want to start?
Sure. I was just going to ping in there. I was like, I don't know if it's me, but yeah, thank you for calling on me. So I would say one, to really prioritize learning and understanding that change is always happening, and as difficult as it is to adjust and to realize that you're changing, for the better, figure out a new way to do things and to shift to that abundance mindset, right? The second thing is really to articulate your story or to articulate your community story. I think that sometimes the power of storytelling can not necessarily dismissed, but isn't always emphasized. And that's one of the easiest ways to kind of capture people's attention. And storytelling can be told in very many different ways, visually, obviously like written stories, but I just think it's important. It's important to keep that paper trail of what has happened in real time from people who are actually experiencing it. And the third thing is, I think I've hit on this a couple of times, is really building those authentic relationships, building trust, and continuously working to support each other. And when issues arise or when conflict arises, which is normal, right, to address those conflicts in ways that are healthy and to continuously build that relationship or to work on those relationships.
Thank you. David, I'm gonna throw it over to you.
Yeah, I think starting off from like a structural organization perspective, really, again, touching back on James' earlier point about the no, getting really comfortable asking why and having folks defend justifications for their decisions. And I think this is both an internal and external thing. And so like for instance, when staff, hey, can we do this particular thing? It's never a nope, and then move on to the next thing, right? There's culture and there's context to why we can't do a particular thing. And if there's justification that makes sense, then it's not a no, it's this thing does not fit, right? It's less of a, I'm saying no because I'm the boss or because I have this power structure, and more of this just doesn't align. And so I think if funders are honest and vulnerable, like this doesn't align with where our funder wants to spend their money. Cool, that's the funder's money. Like that's really great to hear. But saying no, we can't do this because it doesn't work is a completely different conversation that doesn't lead to how do we better align with the particular funder and our particular goals. And I think having that internally creates kind of a culture of why we're doing the things we're doing and why we're being blocked, so that we can get very, very clear about what obstacles we need to move. The second one, I think is probably the most important one, is asking for what you want, not just what you need. And so I think we often get super focused on, oh, I just need this. Like bare minimum, I need this to survive, to get through, to get to the next project. And what that leads is, again, a race to the bottom, a race to this is what will make the program function, but not what will make the program work. And so I think as we start to build out, what do we actually want to accomplish and what do we want from the funder and what do we want from this particular budget, allows us to have a grander perspective of what something will actually cost versus what are we subsidizing with our time that was mentioned earlier. And I think the last part is less of a concrete thing that folks can do and more of just kind of a reality. So I guess it's prepping for it, is recognizing that abundance only works if there's money. Right? Like we can think about abundance, we can hope in abundance, we can shift our perspective to the way in which we treat things. But if we don't have access to the tools to create abundance and sustain abundance, then we'll have a disconnect. And that will lead to, we're pushing for these things, we're communicating these things, we're having people think and drive and work in these different areas, but we actually can't fulfill them. And so does that lead to a disconnect that leads to, distrust or that leads to frustration. And so I think the last concrete element is recognizing where you are as an organization, where you want to be, and what are the barriers in between you and abundance. Because that dream budget of what you want, I think gives you a very, very clear roadmap of where you are and what things need to happen between that and your end result. And so the caveat is, we're still at the whim of funders, right? Like in this space, like 99% of the orgs that are hearing these parts of the conversation aren't generating earned income and revenue, right? They're not selling service, they're not selling products or tools. And so as you shift to abundance, there has to be a clear delineation of, as you move into these different areas, it is okay to recognize that you don't have enough money to fulfill these abundant desires and goals and wishes and hopes. And so I think in that recognition allows you a step-by-step process to say, here's where we want to be, and here's where we're going step-by-step across this journey.
Thanks, David. And then James, we can close this out.
Yeah, well, I think one of them I talked about is saying invest in the things that, aren't working, right? Which sounds counterintuitive, but it's, not the stuff. There's stuff we know just isn't working and can't work because it's the wrong thing, right? And we try things and it doesn't work. It's okay, move on. So invest in the things that aren't working because they're under supported, underfunded. And I was trying to think of this, like when I'm budgeting, what is it that I do? Like, we all know, like, you ask for more than you think you'll get, right? Because it's better to, like in a negotiation, ask for too much and hopefully they'll get you what you need. So the way I'm phrasing this is, I ask for the perfect amount to do this whole grand thing. I'll accept great, but I will actually reject good enough. And I think knowing where that difference is between good enough and great is a challenge. We don't always hit it. I don't always hit it, but there's a phrase, good is the enemy of great, right? And it's like people who do good enough, they're like that prevents them from doing great things. It's like essentially the moderate progressives, right? They feel like they're doing good enough and they're not pushing things further. And so I think perfect is also the enemy of great. Like we wait for the perfect thing to come through and then it never does. And you're like, and it kind of keeps you from doing great things sometimes. So I will ask for the perfect amount when I'm building a budget and when I'm requesting money. I will accept something that lets me do a great job. But if it's something that I think is like, well, I find myself, I think that's good enough. That's where I turn on that. You get more yeses with nos than you do with yeses, right? It's like, you know what? That's just not going to be enough for us to do this in a way that centers Native people. And you have your own screen of what that is. Centers communities of opportunity, centers the scholars, right? For different folks. But for me, that's kind of that. And then my third thing, so there's that, aim accountability at underinvestments, accept great and reject good enough. And then I was reminded of this. I was so glad I went to this meeting in person. Sheila Capistani, who works here in King County for doing great work with Best Starts for Kids and Children and Youth. She was talking about, she was explaining or just reminding me of what like a budget is your values. And I was looking at like people talk about build a budget with values in it or something, or it's like there's like how to build a values-based budget. Your budget is your values. The things we are still like, we're not past capitalism. I'm still stuck with it. We're all still stuck with or in it, even if we fight against parts of it. My budget is my values. So whether you think you're building a values-based budget or not, you probably are. So do whatever you can to really acknowledge where your values are showing up in it, which ones you're going to be advancing and promoting through the budget, whether it's a small grant, a large grant, or an organization-wide budget. And just remember that, like she said, your budget is your values. It's a reflection of your values. I can't remember her phrasing, and I will apologize to her in person next time I see her. But something that reminded me, it's not a philosophical piece. It really is where you put your money where it really matters.
Thanks, James. I think you actually answered the first question we had in the Q&A. Someone shared, I have a conflict in my head and heart about advancing abundance while holding the hope of moving away from capitalism. And just kind of, can you share your thoughts? And so if you wanted to share more, you're more than welcome, but you kind of touched right on that. So if, David or Haregu, you want to share kind of some thoughts to this question?
Sure. Same there. I'm right there with you. I think James said it perfectly. Like, we're in capitalism, and at least currently, my focus in the organization is I do not have a focus to end capitalism at this particular moment. Yes, I hope that we can deconstruct kind of the systems that we live in, and that the work that we do leads to that deconstruction. And so I think about it in terms of how do we use the systems that we can for our advantage? How do we call out where they explicitly don't work? And how do we make sure that we have a unified front of partner organizations, whether they're nonprofits or funders, to make sure that we're all moving into a direction that makes sure that we're comforted, we're taken care of, and we're moving in a space where community is centered. So I think the conflict will always be there, right? Every time we use cash, every time we think about compensating additional individuals at higher capacity, it reinforces kind of this flywheel, this hamster wheel, that we have to be bigger, that we have to scale, that we have to launch, that we have to grow, that we have to be this monumental, huge international organization. And so I think the ways in which I kind of check my internal friction and discomfort with capitalism is realizing where I'm contributing to the dismay and destruction of others. I think to be as blunt as possible, and where I'm looking to take advantage to reinforce the quality work that's there. And so, like, folks deserve to have a high quality of life when they're doing this work, and so do the community individuals who are benefiting. And so, like, those pieces are can't be untethered until the entire structure is decommissioned. And so that doesn't mean pay people poorly, right? Because we want to equalize these other elements. It means pay people well so that they can survive under capitalism. Until we figure out a way to dismantle this, it is not. And I think the framing of warning, like, that is a scarcity element in this moment, right? The reflection, it's not about surviving in capitalism, it's about thriving in capitalism, right? And so thriving in these spaces, I think, is the juxtaposition we try to take and we try to hold, and we try to recognize where are we contributing to problems that we're not currently tackling or supporting, and where are we trying to make sure that folks can thrive under circumstances and scenarios they have no control over. And so I think the long answer short is, yeah, you deserve to be able to have a wonderful life without having to hold the weight of the entire world of capitalism on your shoulders. This isn't your problem to fix. It is a collective, like, global problem to kind of think through. And so you deserve to be able to think in abundance and thriving and in care and in comfort and in luxury and in peace without having to worry about the weight of the world falling on your shoulders for a system we can't individually fix and dismantle.
Yeah, I think David and James, you both made really great points. I don't have very much to add except for just the idea of, Victoria, you wrote moving away from capitalism, and I think that's the goal for everyone, right? We're trying to move away, and it's difficult because it's all around us, right? And we participate in these systems because we have to, and so just for our basic survival, right? And so really thinking about how do we move away? How do we build just economies? How do we support more folks who may be a part of, part of different systems or a part of this capitalistic system? How can we move people away from kind of just thinking about numbers, And so that's really something that we've really hit on. It's really difficult to talk about this, talk about capitalism in general, because it just intersects with everything in our lives. And so how do we not talk about it in a sense? How do we work on dismantling the most toxic aspects of it? And how do we support each other when, we get the backlash from folks who support certain systems? So that's really the way that we kind of approach this idea. I have many partners who, are very anti-capitalist, and they look for ways to support ideas that are, ways to support workers, like supporting labor unions and things like that. So really just trying to be solution oriented and recognizing you don't have, it's not on you to give a solution. It's not on any one person.
Thank you. Our next question is, local government funders are often bound by federal and or state regulations and requirements that are very inflexible, though that isn't what always the reason or excuse of flexibility, as we know. What are examples of building practices and processes that trust and are in abundance within these larger systems and structures that enforce scarcity and division? So what does this look like on a bigger scale with bigger entities?
Can I jump in? I have I think this question came in before we did the like, what are your 3 concrete things? Because I feel like Haregu hit him right there. It was like prioritize learning, tell the story, and build authentic relationships. I was like, that's it. Every time I've had a great local government funder, it's been when I've made sure that I was learning about what their restrictions are and they were learning about what our goals are. We were telling the story of the work and I got to know a little bit of their story. Like, well, trust me, I'm here, but I used to work in the community. I worked at, XYZ community organization for 15 years. I'm like, didn't you get this? I see you're being held by something that's inflexible. You're not creating inflexibility. And this question alludes to that. And then like building authentic relationships, like making sure I think that is within that as well. It's like, but then one framework I was trying to think of, like, how is it that I try to get local government funders or bureaucrats or folks who are, in these positions to move is I need to understand what's policy, what's the actual inflexible, it's code thing, because then I'm going to go chase after and change policy with the support of elected officials. What is guidance, which is the things that they've said, well, this isn't quite policy, but this is the guidance we've gotten from, in Washington State, we say OSPI, or in, the DHS, whatever it is. So policy, okay, we got to get some elected folks or like director or whatever involved. What's guidance? Okay, that's the guidance you give people, but let me understand, like, when you do that, is that because there's, like, how that's like a mushier kind of, still inflexible, but a little mushy. And then what is interpretation? And interpretation is where a lot of this comes in. And it's not even your first person you're talking to. Like, they're a messenger. They're interpreting something based on something they've heard of as kind of like a priority or a value set. And we're trying to do this, this, and this. It's like, okay, you're interpreting a value set. This is coming through as actually a harmful thing, to that value set, and you don't recognize it. So I think kind of figuring out which level this is at. Is this someone interpreting it? Is this guidance that you've actually gotten and are told to pass down? Or is this policy? And I'm not saying you should be stopped by any of them, but just recognize where that person is, because they're a human. Many of them come from community. I know that because the government keeps hiring away all of our good staff all the time. And so they want to be there. They want to learn. They want to hear your story, and they want to build authentic relationships with you. Those are Haregu's points, by the way. All to you, okay?
Thank you, James. I do like the explanations that you gave, though. I think it really, a lot of the wheels are turning. So thanks for giving me credit.
Only other thing that I will add, because almost all of our programs are government contracts, whether they're local or small, is narrow scope. Well, we were in a program and there was like a for-profit partner, and we were like, damn, you are really good at saying this is out of scope. And so like, you paid us for this, these are obligations, these are the other things. These particular parts of the contract that you want us to do but aren't willing to pay us to do are out of scope. And so we learned a lot about like aligning the actual expectations to what it costs. And so if you want to run a program that impacts 100,000 people or 20,000 people or 500 people, but you only want to pay $75, well, I can tell you that this will reach 6 people, right? And so we got super, super good and super, super careful at what we were agreeing to, because we wanted to make sure that we were doing our part as good stewards of community voice, and what we were agreeing to because they had asked us to do, simply because we were already a part of the work. And so it wasn't that, but they're like, oh, well, you're already doing this, so can't you just add this other piece? And we're like, yeah, we could 100% if you paid us to do that other piece, right? Like you would never show up to work and do extra things or take on extra roles and you wouldn't expect this from other companies that are not nonprofits. You wouldn't go to Target and say, well, I bought deodorant and I guess I need soap, so can you just add that in there too? You would never have that expectation in any other atmosphere, but it's common here because it's heartstrings, it's emotions, and it's impacting community. And so we got very good at saying, what are we willing to do completely for free, regardless of scope, because we know the benefit of the folks that we're working with, and what are the things that don't add direct tangible benefit, or we just don't have capacity to if we weren't subsidizing this cost. And so having that internal, kind of like James said, the perfect good, and like what you can do, having those benchmarks for what your boundaries are, and just getting very, very stern. It's the same thing as saying no. This is out of scope. Like, we don't have capacity to do this. We would gladly love to do this if you have funding for it. And so that's the only thing that I'll add to the great points that already been made.
No, those are such great points. As we have 1 minute left together, and Yeah, I'm gonna take some time to really thank the three of you for your knowledge and experience that you created today. That's been amazing. And I just want to create some space for folks to reflect. This is one of my favorite exercises. We call it the head, heart, and feet. But really take some time to think through, what impacted your head, what's stimulated new thoughts, what things were sparked in you. So take the time to reflect on that. What impacted your heart? What really sat with you today? And what really, really meant something to you today? And then your feet. What do you want? What is one thing that you want to do as you walk out of this space? So what is one thing you're committed to? So we call it the head, heart, and feet kind of reflection. And no need to answer that to everyone, but I just want you to take some time to do that for yourself as we transition out of this space. And then Kai, did you want to share a little bit about our last speaker series event?
Sure. Well, I just wanted to also share, thank you so much for being here and for sharing, and for all of you participating in the chat, for sharing your feedback. We will be sending out a short evaluation at the end so that we can continue to gather ideas about topics and ideas that you want to continue discussing in these spaces. And I actually can't remember what the next one is coming up, Manny. Do you know?
Yes. It's this one is it's grounded in storytelling. So Haregu, you actually touched on, I was really excited when you said that, but the power of storytelling in community. And so look for that as we kind of wrap up the Grounded in series.
Thank you so much. If you're interested in watching recordings of the previous ones, I put those links in the chat, and you will be emailed the recording of this. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Thank you, James, David, Haregu, for sharing your stories, your reflections, your learnings, and thank you so much, Manny, for facilitating. Have a great day and good end of your week.
All right, thanks, y'all.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.